I'm just so grateful to be here and to have somehow been here for 17 years. And I'm grateful to the departments and school that I'm a part of, and to my wonderful colleagues in English and in film and in creative writing, and to our wonderful students, and just to everyone for coming tonight. Thank you for being here. No writing or thinking or research happens in a vacuum, and there's just always been a level of support and companionship and collaboration and solidarity, which is never a given in academia. So I'm really grateful for that. And without it, I don't think I'd have written much at all in the last decade, because I'd have been too sad. I'm giving this lecture 2 years late, partly because I was still writing the Book of Jonah, a poetry collection, 2 years ago, and I felt like I needed to finish it in order to really understand what I was trying to say with it, or what I might say about it in the form of a talk. As with any concept album type project, you often have to deal with the potential lack of attunement between the things that you find captivating and interesting and the fact that other people possibly do not. And a couple of public readings I've had over the last few months, that's felt really clear to me. But Maggie Nelson says that we, as writers and artists, we research fairly badly, like magpies. We read until something takes possession of us. And the question of why Jonah took possession of me, or why now, or why at all, is worth me trying to answer, even if, as the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips has it, believing in religion is like believing that adulthood is the solution to childhood. I want to answer it by trying to define two rather difficult and hard to pin down genres of writing, being poetry and prophecy, and it's going to include an account of some of the research and the magpie-like reading and thinking that I undertook over the 6 years that I was working on the book. And I'll start with an attempt at defining the terms via the anthropologist N.K. Chadwick through their book Poetry and Prophecy. Poetry and prophecy are the expression of human thought at its most intense and concentrated moments, stimulated by excitement and expressed in artistic form. Prophecy is the expression of thought, whether subjective or objective, and of knowledge, whether of the present, the future, or the past, which has been acquired by inspiration, and which is uttered in a condition of exaltation or trance, or couched in the traditional form of such utterances. Poetry, it has been said, is the record of the happiest and best moments of the best and happiest lives. This struck me as the biggest citation needed of all time, and it immediately made me think of Stephen Crane's famous 1895 poem, In the Desert, which I'll read. It's big enough again that I don't need my glasses. In the desert, I saw a creature, naked, bestial, who squatting upon the ground held his heart in his hands and ate of it. I said, "Is it good, friend?" "It is bitter, bitter," he answered. "But I like it, because it is bitter, and because it is my heart." I don't really have time to go into the fascinating and extremely sad life of Stephen Crane, cut short by tuberculosis at the age of 28, but suffice to say this may be an extreme example of the antithesis to Chadwick's definition of poetry as a record of the happiest and best moments in the happiest and best lives. But I have been trying for months to find a single poem that does fit its anonymously attributed taxonomy of what a poem is, much as I would like everyone to be happy and to live their best life. It did make me wonder how we're defining best and happiest, whose happiness and at whose cost, and how tolerable it would be to read a single collection or even a single poem that seemed principally to want to tell us how great the poet's life is. Even the contemporary American poet Frederick Seidel, who is very wealthy, tends to juxtapose his dedication to hedonism, gastronomic luxury, and classic motorcycles with a harrowing, all-pervading grief, a focus on physical pain and fear of death. You keep on writing, he says, till you write yourself away. The 19th century mystic and theologian Pavel Florensky talks about the multiple, often contradictory sources of light in Byzantine icons. And you've probably noticed, with any that you've seen in the past, the obsession with folds of fabric and cloth. A lot of gowns and flowing robes that the saints, the figures depicted, are often wearing, almost without exception. And the folds are partly to show that off, the impossible multiple angles of light that are hitting this. The scene is being witnessed, Florensky says, from multiple angles at once, from multiple eyes, from multiple individual people and their particular perspectives. This is, Florensky avers, not a skill issue, but very deliberate. I'm going to try to really briefly go through the story of the original Book of Jonah. Cannot move around wearing these. That's the only thing with reading glasses. You get very dizzy if you pace. Whenever I try and summarize Jonah, I always end up telling a version that is longer than the Book of Jonah in the Bible, so I'll really try and race through this. We're told in the first verse that the word of the Lord comes to Jonah, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." And Jonah says, absolutely not. I hate Nineveh. I don't want to go there, and I don't want to prophesy to them. And he tries to run away from the voice of God. He runs directly to Joppa, a port town. He pays the fee to board a merchant ship sailing to Tarshish in the exact opposite direction of Nineveh. There are a lot of shipwrecks in the Old Testament. That's quite a running theme. Often merchant ships do tend to sink. And also Jonah and his people really hated the sea, as did W.H. Auden. And this comes up in a lot of Auden's poetry. I'll circle back to Auden a little bit as well. On the boat, Jonah immediately goes to sleep below deck, and a terrible storm strikes the ship. The sailors wake him up. He's the only stranger on board, the only person they don't know. And they say to him, "What do you do?" Several commentators note that that's more like something you might say at a dinner party rather than during a life-threatening storm assailing the ship. Jonah tells them that he's a prophet and that he is running away from God and that the storm is quite possibly his fault and that they should probably toss him overboard. As often happens in the Bible, once something has already been decided anyway, they draw lots. And Jonah draws the short straw, which doubly confirms that it's his fault. And the sailors, who are very friendly, generally, apologetically throw him overboard. And Jonah's attitude to this is, at least I'm going to drown, rather than having to go to Nineveh, which would be worse. And then he gets swallowed by a whale. A more accurate translation is a great fish, in which he spends 3 days and 3 nights. He prays repeatedly to be rescued, during which time the great fish, as a sort of mammalian submarine, swims all the way to Nineveh and vomits him up on the shore. And Jonah at this point just resigns himself to the fact that he is going to have to deliver some kind of prophecy to Nineveh. It seems that there is nothing he can do about it, that his course will be endlessly corrected until he just does what he's been commanded to do. So he delivers his prophecy, of which we get roughly half a sentence in the Book of Jonah. And everyone in Nineveh takes it extremely seriously and obeys, and they repent from the king downwards. Even the animals are put in sackcloth. And the success of his prophecy infuriates Jonah, and he goes to sit on a hill overlooking the city, hoping that God might still destroy the city anyway. And he has an argument with God in which he twice asks God to kill him. God provides a plant to shelter him from the heat of the desert sun. The plant is either a kikeon or a eucalyptus or a gourd. People went to war over the translation of the genus of the plant. The plant is there to shelter him, which he appreciates momentarily, and then God sends a worm to destroy the plant, to attack the roots of the plant, and it withers and dies. And then the whole Book of Jonah ends mid-dialogue between Jonah and God, in which they each speak exactly 39 words each through a series of exchanges. And it ends with an unanswered question, ends mid-dialogue. Several of the poems in my collection circle around and kind of reimagine the same scenes, recursively or with variations, often drawing on the panoply of contradictory explanations from the Midrash and from the early church fathers that emerged at different times over the last 2,000 years. I'm going to segue into 2 or 3 poems throughout the talk, just because it felt rude not to. And this one's called Sinecure. Sinecure being a job where you don't really have to do very much. I serve the one true living God. You do? You don't sound terribly happy about it. No. That's not our problem, though. See you to that. He should be in a hammock looking at beautiful prints of fierce creatures, the smell of Greek basil rising from the herb bed, his daughters beguiling him with learned ideas, free will and incantation, one chant accursed ingress to the present moment. Jonah leans against a stack of crates, the boat flanked by jet skis and buzzing insects, looks out implacably at the churning sea, looks out implacably at the still calm waters, looks back implacably at the dim shore receding, looks back implacably at the dim shore long receded. You're looking a little implacable there, buddy. Are you okay? In one interpretation, once he's established as the cause of God's displeasure, the sailors dunk him like a biscuit. Watch. Lower him into the sea and the storm immediately stops. Pull him out again and instantly it rages. They turn him upside down and dip his head. Clouds part, sun dapples the tranquil surface. He emerges gasping as the waves rear up. Let's try a big toe. And God is pacified. He lifts his leg and every body, every barrel rolls into the hull and shatters like a cartoon skull. Crates of remaindered memoirs, marzipan, pin badges saying, "Behold the man." In my version of the story, Jonah makes it to Tarshish, which struck me as something of a missed opportunity in the Old Testament. And he takes various jobs with non-governmental organizations, arts development agencies, and public relations gurus, essentially going to any lengths to distract himself from the call that he's received. And he does eventually wind up in Nineveh against his will anyway. Biblical scholars mostly agree that the Book of Jonah is a work of satire, a late addition to the canon that could have ended up adjacent or apocryphal, but in the event it becomes something quite central. But this is a satire in which the other books of the prophets, of which there are 16, and they're mostly first person, and they mostly consist of the prophecy itself rather than a story about the prophet, are very clearly subverted, upended, and reversed. There are various pieces of textual evidence to back this up, not least the fact that the psalm that Jonah sings in the belly of the great fish, here in this depiction, unambiguously a fish, right? That is not a whale. That's just a vast fish. The psalm that Jonah sings to God, begging to be rescued from the belly of the fish, is itself a collage of lines containing maritime references harvested from the much earlier Book of Psalms. And we can briefly look at verse 5 here. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. The depth closed me round about. The weeds were wrapped about my head. A more technically adept scholar would have done like hyperlinks for exactly where these bits come. I think that's from 120. And King David meant it metaphorically. He was saying, I'm lost, I've screwed up, please help me. But in this case, it's literal because Jonah is actually in the sea. So if the psalm that Jonah is inspired to sing is itself a grab bag harvested from a prior text, that alone suggests that the Book of Jonah is something of a curation, a commentary on prior texts, a revisiting of the past with irony, an early stab at a postmodern novel. Yvonne Sherwood, who was one of my favourite critics that I read while I was researching, says that in the Book of Jonah, familiar genre mechanisms malfunction. And she talks about the story of Jonah as an inversion of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. So in Jonah, the hero is sent on an anti-quest against their will, wishes, and interests, and that of their community. The hero flees from the quest. The quest giver violently puts the hero back on course. The quest is completed, and the hero is so depressed that they want to die. And the quest giver has to spend the whole of the final chapter dealing with the hero's depression and justifying why they sent them on the quest in the first place. Essentially, the Book of Jonah is to the other 16 prophetic books of the Bible, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, etc. You don't need me to tell you. That would just be showing off. It is to those books, it exists to those books, for me, in the same way that Cervantes' Don Quixote exists for the knights errant tales that it's based on, that it parodies. Don Quixote, Part 1 published in 1605, Part 2 published in 1615. Don Quixote believes himself to be a wandering knight, rescuing those in distress, righting wrongs, thwarting monsters, saving communities, but in fact he is just insane, and he's been driven insane by reading too many knights errant tales. And he just causes problems for everyone he encounters. He makes their lives worse, and in the most ridiculous ways as well. And it's where we get the word quixotic, which I think should be pronounced chaotic, but it's not. We have to say quixotic, which feels dumb, but that's that. Quixotic meaning someone highly idealistic and romantic, but also delusional and unrealistic. Adam Phillips, the psychoanalyst I mentioned earlier, who I'll occasionally circle back to, tragic heroes, he says, are failed pragmatists. Their ends are unrealistic and their means are impractical. As with Cervantes, the author or compiler of the Book of Jonah knows the prophetic material well and sets out to destabilize it. So the Book of Jonah is a kind of long and elaborate joke with the punchline missing. The medieval commentator Joseph Kimchi says that Jonah is just a fragment. We don't have the complete text, and we can't know how it's supposed to end or what it's supposed to say. The theologian Sergei Frolov says the author of the Book of Jonah has an urgent message to convey, but they never get round to formulating it. All of that notwithstanding, Jesus refers to Jonah 4 times in the New Testament, and Jonah, as the son of Amittai, has a recorded lineage. He served as a prophet or soothsayer in the court of King Jeroboam II. Should we wish to take the Bible seriously, faith notwithstanding, simply as a narrative, we are given to understand that there was a historical Jonah. So as a text, it is irreconcilably stuck between a joke, a pastiche, a kind of cartoon, and an eyewitness account of the one truly successful prophet, albeit an eyewitness account written by a third-person narrator who could not possibly have witnessed it. We should remember also that in the second book of Don Quixote, published a decade after the first, the characters within it have read the first Don Quixote, a hit novel within its own sequel, and know the text inside and out. Therefore, it's harder for Don Quixote to get up to his hijinks, because everywhere he goes, his infamy precedes him as a kind of anti-celebrity. 400 years later, this is still one of the funniest things of all time. It feels odd talking about the material in this manner, because my own book contains 4.5 parodies of lectures about Jonah, and I feel myself kind of stuck between someone entreating an audience to listen to me and take me seriously and a fictionalized version of what a lecturer might be. I am thankfully not unaccustomed to feeling that way, and we could paraphrase Sartre and de Beauvoir's dialogue. In the end, one must choose between impersonating what one is and nothing at all. We are on thin ice, even as a parody of a lecturer, if we try to define such vast terms as prophecy and poetry. That is what I'm going to try to do with the help of several genuine lifelong scholars and a lot of personal conjecture. The material content of a prophecy is almost always a warning, couched in the most melodramatic, often rather cliched terms, the message being that the audience need to change their manner of being, speaking, and even thinking if they are to avoid some kind of calamity or divine retribution. They have angered God through laziness and complacency, through cruelty and lack of compassion, sheer inattentiveness to the needs of others, and critically, most often, the issue is a lack of hospitality. Eventually, this perversity will set in to such a point that they take active pleasure in the suffering of others. Sometimes there are a few words of encouragement in a prophecy, but even these are usually a little bit passive-aggressive. How often have I longed to take you under my wings like a hen, and this is how you thank me? And so we get the same tropes in the warning. The sun turned to ash, the moon turned to blood. The moon being turned to blood comes up, I think, like 12 times throughout the prophetic books. Joel does it really well, but it's used by most of the prophets. That's great. That's a really dramatic thing to say, that the moon will turn to blood. That'll scare them. So let's say that. We get the sorry quorum of the also-ran horsemen of the pre-apocalypse, as if such humanitarian disasters were not happening anyway, and were not, in fact, the inciting incident that made the prophetic intervention necessary in the first place. Adam Phillips says there is clearly a kind of knowledge born of the absence of experience. It often tends towards cliché and omniscience. There is no language more cliched than the language of the omnipotent, but there is also a freedom to imagine in it. The material content of poetry depends somewhat on the type or movement in question. One could argue that only the worst kind of poem would deign to be so crassly didactic as the average prophecy. And yet, from the confessional self-portrait to the absurdist parable to the neo-modernist mock epic, the fierce polemic of the imagination or identity to the disruption of language, phrasing and thinking in linguistically innovative work, there is a deeper motivating protest, a latent unrest, a heartfelt plea to the collective unconscious, which is not unlike Gordon Cole defending his trans colleague to the other members of the FBI in the third season of Twin Peaks. An act of the imagination is generally an act of protest. However, prophecy is also a consensus medium. It takes place within a specific sealed community predisposed to receive it, a community with the same religion, god or gods from whom the prophecy is said to emanate. If you don't believe in the system, why would you believe in its prophecies? And it cannot really make sense outside of that. But Jonah upends this as well, in that the prophecy is taken to a different community and one that Jonah doesn't even like very much. The people of Nineveh are for Jonah not just despicable, but completely irrelevant to his form and medium. T.S. Eliot says poetry may make us from time to time a little more aware of the deeper unnamed feelings which form the substratum of our being, to which we rarely penetrate. For our lives are mostly a constant evasion of ourselves. Does this constant evasion and being turned and potentially turned back towards ourselves again through poetry bring us any closer to understanding either form? In one of Kierkegaard's reimaginings of the Abraham and Isaac story, he imagines that Abraham is wordless throughout the ordeal and that anyone looking on would simply assume that Abraham had taken leave of his senses. Once something has been correctly filed away, we needn't really look at it again. This good attempt at defining prophecy or just problematizing the genre of prophecy is by Gerald Morris at the University of Sheffield. How can one describe the books called latter prophets? What kind of text is a prophetic book like Hosea or indeed Jonah? The simplest answer, presupposed by more writers than would admit it, is that prophecy is prophecy, a law and genre unto itself. If this is all that one can say, however, then the whole investigation is a dead end. The primary purpose of determining a genre is to suggest comparisons. To say that prophecy is its own genre is to say that a prophetic book may be profitably compared only with another prophetic book. No outside analogues exist, as if this type of writing were created ex nihilo. Surely this is too restrictive. New genres may and do appear regularly, but never from thin air. They come into being in relation to existing genres, perhaps by an extension or a new use of an earlier form, perhaps by combination of two or more, like romanticy. To be content with such a designation, prophecy is prophecy and nothing more, is to suggest the purpose of generic classification is correct filing. A friend of mine who is a member of the clergy warned me off reading biblical scholars. He was like, no, they're really weird, don't have anything to do with them, they're terrible. Not even, but I found them really great. My favourite was Robert Carroll, who wrote during his life a 2,000-page book on the Book of Jeremiah, which I'm about halfway through. This is an essay with a wonderful title, Whose Prophet, Whose History, Whose Social Reality, which Carroll wrote as a riposte to another biblical scholar, Thomas Overholt, who tended to take quite a literal view of the prophetic books and had criticised publicly and in his own essay, Carroll, for being essentially a heathen in his analyses of the prophetic books. Overholt defines a prophet as someone to whom Yahweh has spoken and who freely communicates the contents of this revelation to an audience. Quite so. But many of the prophets represented in the Bible might be better defined as someone to whom Yahweh has not spoken, but who freely communicate their own thoughts to an audience. See Micah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, various others, where the prophet appears to just be really just running their mouth off and openly admitting to that. The larger questions of whether there are gods and persons who might be regarded as speaking to and for them ought to be on the academic agenda, for otherwise all of our deliberations are simply question-begging activities which assume what ought to be demonstrated. It would, however, take up too much time and space to debate this foundational approach to the subject, so I shall accept, for the sake of convenience, biblical assertions about the existence of God. Gods and prophets, but I thought it was more dramatic to end on that. Carroll's wonderful and urgent title can be quite easily applied to poetry should we wish to demonstrate through pertinent questioning who is speaking to us and from where, from what subjectivity and objectivity, and whether that hasn't until the fairly recent past been rather narrow. This could involve some complicated digging or excavation, whether ancient or modern. Trying to trace the sources and inspirations that influenced the authors or compilers of Jonah led me to a similarly pertinent question in the form of Paul Vane's book, referenced by Carroll. Did the Greeks believe in their myths? Which is a really good question. This illustration is by Dura of Arion, roughly 700 BCE, which is about 300 years before the Book of Jonah. Arion was a great lyre player and poet from the island of Lesbos. He won a major literary prize in Sicily and had to travel there to receive it. And then the sailors taking him home decided that they would quite like to steal his prize. At first they weren't going to kill him and steal the prize, but then he annoyed them so much that they thought they might kill him as well and take his prize money. Arion's last request is that he be allowed to sing a final song before being thrown overboard, and the song he sings attracts a dolphin. Dura's dolphin has every appendage an animal could possibly have. It's got wings, it's got tusks, it's got scales, it's got feathers and fur, it's got everything. It's a great dolphin, I think. I wish dolphins did look like that. And maybe they used to, who knows. And Arion is rescued by the dolphin, who takes off and flies through the sky and deposits him back safely at home. This struck me as a very clear forerunner or kind of funhouse mirror, or even a sort of prophecy 300 years before of the story of Jonah, although this was dismissed in a childhood concordance that I had on my shelf as unlikely, but I respectfully disagree. Paul Vane in Did the Greeks Believe in Their Myths? History is also a novel containing deeds and proper names. And we have seen that while reading, we believe that what we read is true. Only afterward do we call it fiction, and even then we must belong to a society in which the idea of fiction obtains. Far from being opposed to the truth, fiction is only its byproduct. There was a time when poets and historians invented royal dynasties, all of a piece, complete with the name of each potentate and his genealogy. They were not forgers, nor were they acting in bad faith. They were simply following what was, at the time, the normal way of arriving at the truth. I do not at all mean to say that the imagination will bring future truths to light and that it should reign. I mean rather that truths are already products of the imagination and that the imagination has always governed. It is imagination that rules, not reality, reason, or the ongoing work of the negative. But of course, they believed in their myths up to the point where their interest in believing ends. Where exactly our own interest in believing ends and why is a question we might ask ourselves quite frequently. I think that I am real, I believe more passionately that you are, and yet we can maybe agree that it would be extremely unwise to underrate the imagination as the locus of many of our struggles. Julia Kristeva says the more texts you include in your mosaic, the more likely you are to jeopardize the point or any kind of fixed meaning. But what is the meaning that we might be eager to fix? Whose point, whose meaning, whose social reality? And if the answer for everyone individually is, well, mine, of course, are we not entering into a kind of radical individualism so lonely it amounts to a sort of propaganda announcement from the autocracy of our inner lives? Yvonne Sherwood writes of Jonah as a story where the protagonist is at odds with his own plot. He is the victim, she says, of the pincer movement of the plot, and this, she argues, repeats in great Jewish literature through the ages. You think of Chaim Potok's The Chosen or the Coen brothers' A Serious Man. The story itself becomes a kind of malign character, and a powerful one, not necessarily one with our best interests at heart. The story of Jonah, she says, is not circumscribed. There is no closure or enclosure. The point is not to comfort us with the idea of a predictable and guaranteeable God, and therefore a sense of predictable and guaranteeable meaning. The Book of Jonah works less like a thesis and more like a riff, a self-conscious story, a story which has somehow become sentient, a story that spins itself out of itself, propelled by the imagination, and one that takes the reader on a discomforting journey of seeing oneself at the periphery of the world. If we do try to circumscribe or to fix this unnervingly sentient story, we get something terribly literal, a conviction inversely proportionate to any idea of what it's trying to say. I'll read one more poem from the collection. The Mosque of the Prophet Yunus. The ruins of the city of Nineveh, close to latter-day Mosul, north of the Great Zab. The Mosque of the Prophet Yunus was built on the site of a demolished Assyrian church, which had been built to mark his tomb. This would imply he never made it home, by choice or otherwise. At the confluence of the Tigris and the Kosor, the mosque was renovated and expanded under the rule of Saddam Hussein, a shrine held sacred by Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The tomb was decorated with ostrich eggshells hanging from the ceiling, a tall bronze candlestick in each corner kept perpetually alight. In the center, presented on a bronze platform, a tooth from the whale which worshippers could venerate as if it were a relic from a saint, a fragment of the true cross, etc. Behold the truth, etc. Perhaps a kiss, a light two-fingered touch. Now, does it matter to you personally whether material reality has any bearing whatsoever on the spiritual? Should we suspend our disbelief? Oh, what a great mind is here a turn, that sort of thing. Are any of our minds so great? A whale's tooth would fit quite snugly in your hand as you marched unto war, and held aloft unscrimshawed could be brought down on anyone you fancied. We could engrave it with scenes from the Book of Jonah, or several lines radiating from a single point. 7 pilgrimages to the tomb of Jonah was seen as equal to 1 pilgrimage to Mecca. The shrine was blown up by ISIS in 2014 after they judged it a place of apostasy rather than prayer, damaging many nearby houses, also much cattle. I'm still really proud of the etc, which means behold the tooth, and is sort of similar to etc, although I don't expect any credit for that. It's fine. No critics notice. It's fine. Whatever. My poem kind of channels the quite cranky voice of Isaac Newton, who, as well as all of the science stuff that he did, was a keen theologian and wrote endlessly, mostly railing against the much exploited superstition of Christian relics and shrines. At least a nail clipping or a fragment of bone from a kneecap could plausibly come from the saint in question. With Jonah, generally, it's agreed that it wasn't actually a whale. But incredulity notwithstanding, the shrine of the prophet Yunus was a genuine symbol of unity, and its destruction a cultural as well as a symbolic tragedy, one that exists quite literally in the material world as a negation, and also in the great continuum of the inner life. Maybe this kind of magic, in terms of relics, imagined or otherwise, is the kind of thing that W.H. Auden rejected or was so circumspect of in his own sense of religion and in his own sense of poetry. It perhaps represents the moment that any reasonable person's faith snaps like a wishbone, but maybe our best poems are going to contain occasionally such impossible and fanciful relics. As with Jonah's catastrophically depressed final dialogue with the Almighty, here depicted by Holbein in a woodcut entitled the Ionis Affligita, anyone can make something more confusing. Randall Jarrell, writing extremely disappointedly about Auden's later works, post-1940, so Age of Anxiety onwards, a lot of books that are these kind of extraordinary bricolages of form, argument, contradiction, diagrams, and multiple voices. And these are books that Randall Jarrell, the great critic, took almost as a betrayal of poetry's power and duty, saying that at times Auden's work collapses into abject frivolity. Underneath the jokes and fantasies and sermons, he writes, there is a chaotic, exhausted confusion. It's not so much that Jarrell is wrong about the chaos and confusion in Auden's later work. He's just wrong not to like it. I would argue that Auden's later books are confusing because they come under the category of prophetic art, or somewhere in between poetry and prophecy. Anybody can deface a painting or tear up a book, but I guess I wanted to resist the writing into the Book of Jonah as a simple distortion or an act of vandalism. Rather, my challenge was to take the text on its own terms, its own chaos and confusion, as a joke, but a joke that we are to take deadly seriously, as if our lives depended on it. And if that includes abject frivolity, so be it. And if we live very much within the second book of Don Quixote, where the audience are exhaustively familiar with the artist, and the artist therefore can't get away with their usual tricks and hijinks and self-delusions, all the better. Jesus replied, "A wicked and perverse generation demandeth a sign, but none will be given it except for the sign of the prophet Jonas." But that sign is one of refusal, here represented by the great fish literally vomiting, refusing the call in Jonah's case, which manifests in my book through Jonah taking promotions and marketing jobs in Tarshish, with prophecy as a kind of TV demagoguery, or streamers, or pundits, or stand-ups, or podcasters, or writing workshops, or public speakers, soft diplomacy roles that absorb Jonah's time and energy and never seem to go anywhere while the world gets worse and worse around him, and the ongoing work of the negative threatens to erase us and all meaning with it. Is all of this somewhat hopeless and cynical, and somewhat closer to the act of vandalism I was trying to avoid, something that can inspire at best only a great despondency? Thinking, I suppose, as I often am, of Frederick Jameson's criticism of Foucault's critiques of power, where he coined the kind of winner-loses term, wherein the more thorough and convincing the critic or the artist's depiction of power, the more totalizing and pervasive, the less room there is for any for any resistance or liberation. The more Foucault wins, he writes, by portraying society as carceral, as prison-like, the more he loses insofar as his critical voice of refusal becomes increasingly paralyzed. What then shall we do, having received any kind of a call to poetry, in which I include fiction, criticism, screenwriting, to be honest, the artistic or creative impulse generally? And this was where I turned to the contemporary Italian philosopher Federico Campagna, whose work I was introduced to by Dr. Holly Pester during the pandemic. In his book, Prophetic Culture, Recreation for Adolescence, faces the question of how we are to leave a fertile cultural legacy to those who will come after us, to those, he says, who will come after the end of our future, because futures end too. One of the terms Campagna wrestles with in prophetic culture is worlding, the making of a meaningful world or time segment in which we might exist and hopefully thrive. We may have organizations that manifest as a result of this, but it's essentially something that takes place in the imagination, in our hearts and minds. He writes movingly of the colonial violence and erasure of indigenous cultures, and what is taken, among many other things, is the ability to world as a verb. For Campagna, the world has ended many times before, but up until now we've been left with meaningful ruins to interpret and to build a strange new world out of. And the fear expressed in Campagna's prophecy is that the whole of the digital as a physical presence will be reduced to dust, that we risk leaving no record, garbage rather than ruins. He calls prophecy a pastime because it is an art, a free gift, a thing we do without practical purpose, and a pastime for adolescents because the adolescent is yet to accept the world they were born into, yet to accept its rules and systems of power as a natural order. It's the adolescent who still has the energy to see it as possibly arbitrary and to rebel against it if necessary. He works also with Spinoza's conviction that the prophets in the Old Testament, generally speaking, had debilitating stammers, and that was one of the first reasons why they hesitated to think that they were seriously being chosen as a prophet. And that's what Moses means when he says that he's not a man of words. Beckett's formula, "I can't go on, I'll go on," is perhaps the briefest definition of tragedy, but it is just as apt a description of the condition of the prophet. Moses had a stammer because a prophet has to have a stammer. The stammer, Campagna says, is a smoked-up mirror, and without the effective strangeness of art, prophecy becomes empty, non-interpretable, not a useful ruin. And as far as Companion is concerned, prophetic art will and should always be slightly awkward. Inevitably, the finished work of prophetic culture appears always unfinished. It is imperfect, incomplete, lacking or excessive, not because of insufficient skill or due to a mannerist posturing, but precisely to point to a particular way of reading a prophetic work which might ignite a transformation in a subject's fundamental mode of worlding. So it's not meant to be good, you're not meant to like it. It's meant to be awkward, it's meant to be difficult, it's meant to annoy you. Trying, I think, to sort of aim for that impossible multiple perspectives that Florensky writes about on Byzantine icons, the light hitting the scene and the material at an infinite number of angles. Our cause as artists, as writers, if it's anything, is to fix our hearts to resist the official version, which most of what we write is an attempt at correcting. And the official version is only ever motivated by self-interest, by fierce defense of the systems and institutions that protect those self-interests, which are essentially avarice. The post office scandal, which was only widely reported and prosecuted once it had been made into an ITV drama, somewhat too late for those who'd already lost their livelihoods, reputations, or indeed lives, is a feature, not a bug, a standard, not an outlier. The official version is not a form of worlding, it is that which prevents the worlding, that which makes worlding possible. Just as artificial intelligence and art generated by it, its flooding of the zeitgeist and the psyche with endless, hideous drivel, its trampling on the basic foundational concepts of authorship, imagination, and humanity, is an inherently fascistic medium and technology. AI art is art for oligarchs, the closest the merely wealthy can get to the actual power of art. And they hate art because art questions, analyzes, and dismantles the myths that their power is built on and finds it empty. None of us wants it, and none of us asked for it. I suppose what I'm saying is our enemies are real, even if the battleground for most of us remains the imagination. In even bringing things like that up, am I describing our Nineveh or railing against those who need to fix their hearts or die? Will they maybe repent if they hear just the right poem at the right moment? Or are they, aside from when they once chose to emulate the benefactors and patrons of eras past, simply the natural predators of art and any kind of a life that might involve it? I often find myself wrapped up in the weeds and churning waters of contemporary literature as an industry, the outlandish claims for its powers, moribund commercial endeavours, capricious and narrow celebrations, the innumerable books published every year that don't receive a tenth of the recognition or audience that they deserve. I'm not crazy about its claims to moral or humane superiority. In a way, one of the questions that my Book of Jonah asks is, what if the unofficial legislators were even worse than the official ones? One cannot separate literature and life, Graham Greene says. If an age appears creatively, poetically empty, it is fair to assume that life too had its emptiness, was carried on at a lower, less passionate level. But the thought of living in an artless world horrifies me, as I suppose it must you too. And art only goes badly wrong, only becomes worthless to me when it is made another trinket of reputation and status. And then perhaps it does become a record of the happiest and best moments in the best and happiest lives. A court minstrel, a court jester or soothsayer, a role, I suppose, on reflection, it was best that Jonah left for less authorized audiences. I don't expect ever to feel anything other than ambivalent about my own writing, but I know that if we're not doing this, if we give it up as a misguided, quixotic ambition in a bankrupt attention economy wherein even our habit of reading is being systematically eroded by the wealthiest people in the world, if we give up, I feel like it's all over for the inner life and the worlding that emanates from that. And with it, the power to understand or resist much of anything that would keep us thus trapped. If there is a call, if there is a word that comes to us, it is a collective one, but it starts with an act of selfhood. and a refusal to be defined by the power structures around us, a defiant and thorough corrective to the official version, in order to paraphrase Alistair Gray. That mural by Alistair Gray he painted in 1960 in just someone's flat, and then it got painted over and had to be restored 10 years later. He also, Alistair Gray, I read just recently, developed a puppet show of Jonah, which I can't find any footage of at all. I wish that I had. At some point I'll try and find that. I'll put it on canvas. In order to paraphrase Alistair Gray, anyway, that we might work as if we lived in the early days of a better world. If this works, it will be extraordinary, but I'm going to try and play some music on my phone and hold it to my lapel mic. And if it doesn't just cause an explosion, that's great. I'll finish on, thank you so much for listening. It sounds really dramatic saying thank you for listening. I'll finish on the last poem in the Book of Jonah, so apologies for spoilers. Look, you wouldn't get it. One of the pleasures of listening to a lecture is to imagine yourself elsewhere. In the bar afterwards, your lover's arms, in cahoots with a hysterical sunset. Had we a window, you could build a house on the hills. This is also a stocktake. Do you see, changes slide, in this Greek icon of uncertain provenance, that the whole story is depicted at once? That in the bottom left, the sailors lower Jonah by his feet to be dropped into the ocean, to be received by the great fish like communion. The great fish appears twice in the bottom left corner, arranged like the zodiac symbol for Cancer, in a swirl like Van Gogh's Starry Night, swallowing Jonah from right to left and spitting him up on the shore from left to right. These are reading systems, sinistro-dextral, dextro-sinistral. Many of those depicted in icons are either writing or holding open published books. This instills the questionable idea that the whole affair is somehow ennobling. It would be good to conclude with something genuinely divinely inspired, something that does not even try. It was a Tuesday. It was every single Tuesday overlaid when I walked down the same path to the right of the molecular biology department, a peculiar arrangement of what had been planted where and the many different substances set beneath our feet, the curl of one specific leaf, dark brown and still attached, none of it strictly intentional, as if that matters. You are my God because you have no need of my goodness. I had a cold, I was behind on several references, but for the first time in my experience, the act of prayer felt as natural and immediate, involuntary, in fact, as breathing in and out. On a cellular level, I mean, I was so grateful. And with this newfound power, I said absolutely nothing to God, and he did not reply. Thank you.